stoma gets routed to the anterior abdominal wall, about whether it comes across the peritoneal cavity or whether it goes extraperitoneal. I point that out because this technique was described back in the 1950s by John Gallagher. And when we look at the recommendations that come out from some societies saying that you could consider that as a way of lowering the rate of parastomal hernia, the data tends to be based on studies that were done in the 1970s, and the studies that have been done more recently, highlighted over there, all come from the Far East, where the average body mass index of the patients they operate on is 22. That's not reflective of the population I see. And so most of what we've got in terms of what are risk factors for developing hernias are all retrospective case series with all the bias that we know come with that. And I think it's fair to say that surgery in patients have changed beyond all recognition. About 65% of all colorectal cancer resections now are laparoscopic in the United Kingdom. And we don't know how keyhole surgery, with its reduced rate of intra-abdominal adhesions, impacts on the rate of hernia formation, because the bowel's more free to move around, potentially causes more problems in a different sphere. So just looking at some of the things that we've got from our initial cohort, this is from about the first 380 patients who were recruited before the change, with the retrospective consensus including leukoileostomies. First thing, as you can see, is just whereabouts a stoma is located. Well, 88% roughly coming through the rectus sheath and through the belly of the rectus abdominis muscle. And you can see here, this is what's changing matters, is that when people are creating stomas in patients who've had laparoscopic surgery, about 40% are using a trocar site, either a priori or adapting a trocar site to form the stoma site. And I was always taught as a registrar that should be absolutely forbidden. Your stoma site should be sacrosanct, and you make it as best as you possibly can, because it's the one chance that the patient gets. Using ports to puncture bluntly through an abdominal wall might not be the best way to make a stoma site. And we also can see here that it appears that 90% of patients don't have any suture buttressing of that traphyme, but 10% are. And that was a technique that I never came across, and certainly hadn't come across until relatively recently when we were designing the CRFs for this technique. So it's been quite a revelation for me to discover that that's something that's been used far more widely than I'd ever anticipated. In terms of the patients that we're getting, what's interesting to note is that we've got quite a large number of patients who don't have cancer. And you can see as well that our ages differ between those two groups, which is perhaps not surprising. The proportion of our patients who smoke now is dramatically lower than it used to be in days of yore. In those series from the 70s and 80s, about 30 to 40% of the population smoked at that time. Current NHS England data suggests it's 16% for adults. And the proportion of our patients who have diabetes, because of the obesity epidemic that now affects us, has gone up instead. We also, for the first time, are getting accurate data of pre-existing abdominal wall hernia and about how that might predispose to subsequent parastomal hernia formation. Fairly unusual. No one else has had this before. So, I did mention earlier that there have been a lot of prospective studies done looking at prophylactic mesh use, and it's worthwhile noting how different we are to those studies. So in all those RCTs, essentially the upshot is that most of them were in end colostomies in patients who'd had elective rectal cancer surgery. So what are we seeing, and what are we studying, and what's different? Well, this is all the mesh RCTs aggregated together and the data that's come out of CIPHER. Some bits are missing as the data wasn't entirely complete, but it will mature over time. We've got a far higher rate of patients with ileostomies being included, which is more representative of the total number of stomas that are out there. And also the indications for surgery, 70% of our patients have cancer, 30% have either IBD or benign conditions. So again, it's much more representative of the patients who have stomas. So we're getting data which is more relevant to the people who we treat and for the NHS, which is important. And in terms of measuring the outcomes, on here I've highlighted all the different RCTs that have been done before and what they actually included or didn't include. Most of them did clinical examination as their clinical occurrence of a parastomal hernia. Some have got CTs, a few have got classification, most have got complications. But things like safety of mesh implantation or whether the patient subsequently has repair or any patient-reported outcome measures of quality of life data are often absent. Whereas with CIPHER, across the board, well, with patients we'll know whether they've got a parastomal hernia by asking them with the parastomal hernia questionnaire that have been developed by Jane Glasby and her colleagues. We've got all the CTs, we'll be able to do the classification work. We can collect the complications as we've already seen. We'll know in a large proportion of them about long-term mesh safety because we've got the HES data which tells us whether they go back to have mesh removal. We'll know whether they've had further parastomal hernia repairs. We'll know from some of their patient-reported outcome measures what some of the indications might be, although we won't have the detailed, nuanced reason from the letters that are documented in the patient notes. But I think, as Sue will quite happily tell you, some of that documentation is less than perfect anyway. The other aspect that we're looking at in particular as well is the nuance between this parastomal hernia and this parastomal hernia, as you can see on the screen. Certainly previously, when all the other studies have looked at this, they've tended to power all their study and all the interventions that have been done and all the risk factors on a binary outcome. Do you have one or don't you? And I'm not certain it's as simple as that. There are many different classifications that are out there. We don't know whether any of them are any good. Some of them have said that it's all about the size of the hernia sac itself and how much it bulges. And they mean that certain conditions could be considered a parastomal hernia. So in the top in the middle there is what's called a subdermal prolapse or a siphon loop. Some classification systems say that is a parastomal hernia, whereas there are other ones which say no, it isn't. And part of the problem is that if you want to know how common some of those problems are, it depends how you do the CT scan. Do you do it with the patient lying on the back? Do you do it with them lying towards the front? Do you do it while they're straining, for example? So it's all highly variable. And I have to say, I think it'll be useful for us to find out a little bit more about the data in terms of how big the hernia sac is and also how big the trephine is in the patient's anterior abdominal wall and whether there are concomitant incisional hernias at the same time, because it might well help us figure out about the symptomatology that patients have, what drives them to go and seek further intervention or to see their stoma care nurses for conservative measures. So I think the previous way of just having a binary outcome, either there is a parastomal hernia there or there isn't, I think we've moved on from that to a much more nuanced understanding. So how do we differ? Well, for the first time, we're going to get contemporaneous surgical data, which represents our current practice. We've got participants who are more representative of the population of patients with a stoma as a whole, and we'll have outcomes from this which are much more relevant to patients as well. Thank you.